Hello and welcome everybody to today's Ask the Gardener here on The Irish Gardener on Facebook, and also of course now on LinkedIn and on YouTube. In a while I'm going to be having a conversation with Amy Adwan, ecologist and environmental scientist and prolific YouTuber and on social media. Very interesting lady that I'm going to speak to in a while about the whole discussion of the importance of native wildflower seeds and non-native wildflower seeds and species in general. Is it all much ado about nothing, or is it vitally important? So we'll have a chat about that in a while. But first, before we start, I want to go straight into some questions which have come in during the week. And the first is from Colette Higgins, who's also sent me a photograph, is asking, "Hi Peter, I have a 6 and 7 year old cherry blossom which seems to be shedding its leaves in the last month. Not just when it's windy over the last week." Sorry, so it's been very windy over the last week, but it's been shedding its leaves for a while longer. "There's a pile of leaves on the ground underneath the tree. There is also a growth on it which I didn't cut out. Not sure if that's affecting it." So I'm just going to bring up Colette's photograph there and see if we can get to the bottom of it. I have an idea what's causing it, Colette. I did see the photograph. You have a pile of leaves, as you say, collecting on the ground. I don't see a photograph of the growth, right? So you didn't send me a photograph of the growth, and I suspect that could be the problem, Colette. I don't want to panic you, but I suspect it could be some type of canker, which can be quite common on cherry trees. Unfortunately, it's bad news. So I would send in it can be bad news. I would send in a picture of the growth to me. I'll have a look at it. See, if it is a cankerous growth, what we need to do is remove the infected growth. We need to remove the infected stem with that growth on it. We'd expect to see other symptoms as well in a cherry, like shot hole, which is little holes in the leaves, and maybe a bit of gummosis, which is like an oozing of a kind of slimy, sticky liquid out of the bark. If the canker is on the main stem, we're in trouble, I'm afraid. If it's on just some of the side branches, we might still be able to save it. So do send me in a picture of that, Colette, if you can. Just having a quick look at a few other questions. As I said, in a minute we'll be talking to, or I'll be having a chat with ecologist and scientist Amy Adwan about the importance, or maybe not the importance, of native species versus non-native species in our planting. So stay tuned for that and get a question in for Amy if you want. I know she'll be only too delighted to answer. I'll be able to help perhaps horticulturally, but ecologically I'll hand over to Amy. Now, there's another question from Rita Lally here. And Rita's also sent in a picture. "I have several hydrangea vanilla frays, which is this beautiful paniculata type hydrangea, really gorgeous one. Now they're doing well except for one, which has developed curled brown patches on its leaves, some of which are falling off. Otherwise the shrub seems fine. I recently fed it some hydrangea food, and a couple of days later this started to happen, which of course might be a coincidence. They are well watered. Any advice welcome." Well, Rita, you sent in a photograph too, and I'll bring it up here. It could be a couple of things actually, Rita. It could be just, it's hard to make out totally from the photograph, but it could be just a symptom of overfeeding, in fact, particularly if it happened just a day or two after, or as you say, of course, that could be a coincidence. What's very possibly the matter with that is it could be aphid damage or some scale insect or something like that. One of these sap suckers which feed like it sounds on the sap in the leaf vein, so it removes all the goodness from the leaf and makes it, it causes it to curl rather. Could be that. It could also, looking at it, possibly be a fungal infection, in which case, as always with fungal infections, my first piece of advice would be remove any infected growth. If it is a sapsucker, I'd say the same. If it's just on a few of the tips of the plant, just prune it off, prune it out, hope for the best. If it persists and if it spreads, we might look at using something like copper sulfate to control. It's a broad spectrum fungicide. It is certified for use in organic gardening, so it is something that I'm okay to use, but not willy-nilly, if you like, just once a year. So we want to be sure that that's what it is before we go treating it with something like that. Now, there is another one, a couple that came in before, just during the week, so before today, and then we'll get to the live ones. So Mary Wells, "I have planted the shrub Acer palmatum atropurpureum," which of course is that beautiful purple-leaved, the hint is in the name, isn't it? It's that beautiful purple-leaved Japanese maple. I've only planted it in May. It's now brown on the edge of the leaves. also new growth now. So I'm presuming what she means is that there's brown on the new growth as well. So Mary, that's thankfully a very easy one to diagnose, but also to cure. It's wind damage and drought. So Acer palmatums, or the Japanese maples, don't like to be in a windy situation. So the way they tell us that, if you like, is by the edges of the leaves going brown and curling up, and particularly that very, very tender new growth. It'll go brown if it's drying out. If it's too dry, the wind will dry it out. That's what's causing it. So it could be lack of water exacerbated by wind damage. So that's what's causing it. So try watering it some more. I wouldn't panic. Don't panic at all for the moment. Just keep watering it some more. Now, I know nature did it certainly for the last couple of weeks, but we're into this lovely hot dry spell again with the Azores high. Long may it continue. So do pay attention to watering. If you're keeping it very well watered and it's still happening, then it's possibly too windy a situation, so you might have to move it in the autumn. A good tip if you're ever planting a Japanese maple, and this is for anyone, what I always suggest is, before you plant it, because they are, as I say, susceptible to wind damage, grow it in a pot and move that pot. So position the pot where you think you might want the Acer, and before you plant it, see if it grows there. So just leave it there in a pot for a season. If it's no wind damage, then that's great. If it is getting wind damage there, then you know that's not the right place to plant it. But in your case, it should be very easy to move this, Mary, but I would probably wait till the autumn for now. Anne is asking, and when would I prune a wisteria? Well, a wisteria, Anne, you prune it now, actually. Prune it spot on now, July, August. You actually prune them twice. So if you never prune a wisteria, it's not the end of the world. It's still going to flower away for you, don't worry. But it'll also produce lots and lots of twining green growth, and it might be too vigorous for where you have it. So what I do with wisteria at this time of the year, and I have one at home, and it is very, very vigorous. So I try and identify the main stems. So in other words, I identify the thicker stems and where I want them to go. And all the side shoots that are coming off those main stems, you might want to keep 2, 3, or 5 or 6 main stems, depending. But all the side growth that's coming off them, prune it back to about 4 or 5 leaf buds or leaves at this time of the year from that main stem. It just tidies up the plant. And then you leave it at that, and then come February next year, February, early March, those stems which we cut back now, just reduce it. We're cutting them back to 4 or 5 buds now, go back to 2 or 3 buds in February. As I say, it'll flower away even if you don't, so don't panic. But if you want to keep it tidy and really see the blooms instead of the foliage, that's what I would do. Excuse me. Now, there are a few more questions coming in there, but before I get to the other questions, I want to have a chat with Amy Adwan. Now, Amy is an ecologist and an environmental scientist. She's prolific on YouTube and on social media, very interesting lady, and I want to speak to her about, you've probably heard that there's often discussion about the importance of native Irish wildflower seeds and species in general, and non-native species, and which are more important and why are they more important, or is it all much ado about nothing? So I suppose without further ado, I'll bring on Amy and we'll have a chat. And if you do have any questions for Amy, please do, or myself, please do get them in the comments there below. Now, hopefully, as I say, I don't have James, my helper, with me, so hopefully I'll manage the tech stuff all on my own. Amy, how are you? Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Peter. I'm good. How are you?
I'm very good, very, very good. Tell us a bit about yourself. You're very welcome. You're very welcome, and thanks, as I say, for joining. But tell us a bit about yourself. I'm aware of you because I've been looking at you on social media and that. But for those who aren't aware, who are you, as the fella says?
Right. So, I'm an ecologist and environmental scientist, nature lover, wildlife obsessed, I would say. I've always been interested in nature since I was a young child, and that kind of gradually went on later in life. I studied environmental science at the University of Limerick, and I then went on to work in ecological consultancy, which is where I still am now. In my day job, I work with bats mostly. I do a lot of bat surveys and surveys for developments. And in recent years, I've become very interested in botany and plants. I run a YouTube channel that is mostly around tropical houseplant care indoors, as you can see behind me. And I guess why I'm on here today, I used to live in a very wild place where I would observe lots of increases of biodiversity over the years. And of recently, we moved into a residential housing estate with a small garden. And I started really becoming interested in wildflower meadows and how many people are talking about them. It's something I would recommend in my day job quite often, but I really wanted to look into the reasons why these wildflower meadows are good or not. And I guess I made some content about that, and that's why I'm on here today to speak with you about it.
And I think that that's great. And as you say, you're recommending them a lot in your day job. And it seems, I suppose, in many ways, it might seem that the whole world has gone wildflower mad, which on the one hand, or maybe with both hands, is to be absolutely lauded and encouraged, because bees, pollinators, and so many of our species are under threat. But you say it comes with a warning is probably the wrong word to use, but I suppose the crux of the question is, how important is it or not to use native Irish wildflower seeds when we're planting wildflower meadows in the first instance, but also, do we need to actually plant any seeds, native or not, or should we just let things go wild? Should we let rewilding take place?
Well, personally, on the face of it, I am all for rewilding. I think that is the best approach. But to answer the question of why are native species important, what's funny about this, and I think what happens a lot in ecology and the management of the environment, is that the answer is not straightforward. And as much as I would like it to be, and to try to communicate that, our ecosystems are super complex and intricate, and there's many different variables and elements that all work together to form the balance of our environment. And so, there's so much that we don't know about these connectivity that go on in between our ecosystems. And so to manipulate or create that through our own planting is actually really difficult. And so to answer the question, I would like to talk about two different aspects of it. One is to do with why are native plants important when it comes to plants and habitats. And the second one would be about our pollinators. So why are plants important for native habitats? Everything in the ecosystem has a role to play. Okay, so when we're introducing non-native species, they're just displacing our native ones, and they're resulting in competition, which can lead to habitat loss, biodiversity loss, which we all know is a big thing these days, especially when it comes to climate change. And so introducing these foreign species which don't already exist can lead to a host of different problems that are super varied. And a lot of them we're not aware of yet.
Can I interrupt you there, Amy? Can I interrupt you there for 1 second? This is just, as I said to you earlier on, I'm not trying to trip you up. These are questions for myself as much as for those watching. You talk about we need to enhance biodiversity, which we know. But surely bringing in any species, obviously with the exception of invasive species, but bringing in any extra species is not, because my understanding of biodiversity really is the more species we have, the more that can be sustained. We want as diverse a range of species, both plant and wildlife, in the garden as possible. So am I wrong in my thinking that bringing in any species will help promote biodiversity?
Yes, I think actually. So I think that biodiversity, you're correct, that we want as much diversity as possible. But like I was saying, each element in the ecosystem plays a role, okay? So if we are introducing any old species, that's messing with the balance that is already naturally there, okay? So let's say we have a native Irish plant that has connections with the pollinators, the soil, the microbes, the pests and diseases. It has so many things that it's connected to that it results in its functioning. But then if you're introducing a species that is not already evolved to be in our Irish ecosystem, it's bringing in or trying to connect with something that it's never going to connect with because it belongs in its wild ecosystem in a different country. And so if we're trying to support what's already existing in our Irish landscape, we're doing it a disservice by just introducing a non-native species that maybe might be, for example, a pretty wildflower that provides nectar at a certain stage in something's life cycle, but it doesn't do all of the other things that it's connected to.
I get what you're saying. I do get what you're saying, but I suppose I still have a couple of queries on it.
Yeah.
The first one being, like, if we look at an awful lot of our hedgerow plants and what we regard as quintessentially Irish, such as, the fuchsia and the Montbretia and so many, many more, none of them are native, of course, but I don't think they're doing untold damage, and I do think they have, if it's the correct word, assimilated into the Irish ecology. No, I'm not an ecologist, and I need to stress that. I'm a horticulturalist. But to me, they seem to have assimilated into the Irish ecology and the Irish landscape very, very well, but maybe I'm wrong. And the other question I have for you is, and again, it's just me trying to get my head around this, but because ever since I left college, like I said to you in our original chat, I've always been espousing the importance of only using native Irish species and native Irish wildflower seeds. But, several years ago, I started questioning myself, why? And I still don't, of course, have the answer. And as you've correctly said, the answer isn't always that simple. But I've been questioning and saying why, because the bees, and as you've alluded to, the bees and pollinators do feed on these plants. I accept what you're saying, that, okay, there's more to the ecological jigsaw than just that bit of nectar. But if we go back to, let's say, specific species, let's say a cowslip, the Primulaveris, that everybody knows and loves, myself included, and they are native to Ireland, if I'm right. So is it important that if we're sowing cowslips, that the provenance of the seed can go back a few generations, that we protect that the genetic species in Ireland, or will any cowslip seed do? I'm just using cowslip as an example, of course.
Yeah, so the first question about, let's say, naturalized species, like you were saying, the Montbretia and stuff like that, there is a lot of elements. Even our sycamore is non-native, that it can be found throughout our entire island. Now, almost all of these are garden escapes. But on top of that, most of our invasive species that are having great impact, like Himalayan balsam or Japanese knotweed, are generally garden escapes. And so it's just a situation where those became invasive and affected our ecosystem that way. And the other ones maybe less so, like, as we were saying, Montbretia might have just naturalized and it just becomes part of it. But the thing is that my personal opinion is that it reduces the risk of something going wrong. Because if you're choosing the native species, it already is, it's evolved to work in that ecosystem already. And so it just removes the risks of things becoming invasive or introducing a disease that shouldn't be there and stuff like that. That answers that question.
It does, and before you get to the next part, if you don't mind, I just think we'd have, number one, I think we'd have a very dull landscape, but for those naturalised fuchsias, Montbretias, sycamore, beech, birch. I mean, we don't have a huge range, unfortunately, of native Irish species. But also, like when you say it's not worth the risk, and I'm not necessarily coming down on the other side. In a way, I'm just being devil's advocate here, because these are questions that I get asked too. Like, the risks that we are facing now, that we're all aware of as regards species extinction, can we afford not to take the risk, if you know what I mean? Like, if we're Puritan about just sticking to native Irish species growing in Ireland, will we have enough to sustain the whole tapestry?
Okay, so in your first point, that being that there isn't a huge amount of native Irish species to choose from, the reason for that could be that they have been displaced by other species that have been naturalized. In my experience in my job, at least, and traveling around the country, there is a huge amount of native Irish species in certain landscapes where they've been allowed to grow. For example, like the Burren, which is a fantastic example, there's a lot in bloom in there at the moment. The diversity of orchids and natural flowering species that are there already is amazing. And on the other point, I think something that I personally fall back on is that nature knows better than me. Nature knows better than us. We don't understand all of these interspecies relationships and connectivity yet. There's a lot of great studies being done, but we have a long way to go and a lot more to learn. And so we don't know what effect other species that we've introduced are going to have 50 years down the line. We don't know these things. And I think there has to be a bit of a respect to step back and let nature run its course and let nature restore the balance itself. Now, obviously, we have affected that balance through climate change and pollution and things like that. So we may need a little bit of help. It may need a little bit of native planting to get it kick-started to try to restore the balance. But that really is the best way to serve. And a prime example of that is rewilding projects that have taken place and the amazing things that have happened with biodiversity in very short amounts of time when you just take a step back and you let nature do its thing.
Yeah, no, I'm 150% with you on that. Don't worry, on the rewilding, and I absolutely think that yes. And I mean, it goes without saying that nature knows substantially more than the both of us, and rewilding can only be encouraged. But I suppose the truth of the matter, and I could talk all day to you about this, Amy, but I'm conscious of time. I suppose the truth of the matter is, no matter what you feel or I feel, we have non-native alien species, call them what you will, prevalent throughout Ireland, and every country does, in garden centre plants, in gardens which escape into the wild, which are sometimes put in the wild. Whatever the rights and wrongs of it, I suppose, which will this conversation will go on for well after our time. How do we, like, accepting that, and I don't think this is what you're trying to say anyway, but accepting that we'll never create an Ireland that is horticulturally 100% Irish and native, or both horticulturally or ecologically. So what is the safest, best way to progress? Like, I suppose what I'll do is I'm going to give you my take on it, which is that in public areas, we should only either let it rewild, or if we want to try and add to it, only use native Irish seed if we're looking in the greater landscape. But in our own gardens or in areas like like when I say parks, I mean housing estate parks, things like that. What is your feeling? How am I right in that thinking, if you like, that or how do we marry both, that we have such a plethora of foreign species and maintaining the integrity of the native Irish species?
Well, I think that you're right in saying that the siting of what you decide to do is incredibly important and to what your decision and your reasoning is going to be. So if it is your garden, I think there's a responsibility on gardeners, as you know yourself, that to understand what you're planting, understand how its seed dispersal is undertaken. So that you're having a responsibility that, okay, if you want to have these non-native species in your garden, you're ensuring that it's not going to leave that. It's not going to end up being transported to a nearby river and becoming colonized and resulting in issues. I think understanding what you're planting is a big thing and responsibility on people. But in terms of other areas, I think that, I'd like to bring it back to the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan, which you might be aware of, which is a super fantastic resource and has loads of really helpful information and beautiful illustrations to help people understand what is important to support our pollinators, which is huge ranging. It's not just the bees, it's hoverflies, it's butterflies, moths, ants, bats, even in some areas of the world as well. And so the diversity of habitats creating in your garden, excuse my dog, is the best way, I believe, that we can serve that. And yes, even in the pollinator plan, you can plant some non-native species as long as they are safe and that they are not creating more harm than good with what we know already.
Yeah.
So,
and of course I'm familiar with the Pollinator Plan, and I've been one of its, or not, maybe not one of its, but I've been a huge proponent of it and a huge supporter of it since its inception. I totally stand behind it. For what it's worth, I better clarify something I said. It probably came out wrong when I said that if we rely purely on native Irish species, we won't have that many. I accept we do have thousands upon thousands. I didn't mean that. That came out wrong. There's a comment coming in here. I don't know if you can see it there now. Hopefully you can see this, Amy. From Trevor McCarthy, loving the episode. And just on that note, if anybody is loving the episode, please feel free to share it on whatever social media you're watching it on. It will help get the video out and get the word out for anybody else who might be interested in the conversation. Trevor is contacting us through LinkedIn. Is it possible to bring in legislation to mark packaging for seed as wildflowers as native or non-native? Are there any studies on the effect that non-native species have had? In my job, I often get asked by well-meaning members of the public about sowing wildflowers. And I think I'm right, Amy, in saying that Trevor, a bit like myself, works in retail horticulture. So he would be at the coalface, so to speak. I find myself very much, between my work in retail and in the media, very much at the coalface I'm always being asked, about the difference between native and non-native, and is it worth spending more money, because they are substantially more money to purchase the native. Which is one of the reasons that I've had this conversation with many people, but it's one of the main reasons why I want to chat to you today as well, just to shed more light on it. Anything there in Trevor's question, is it possible to bring in legislation, do you think, to mark, it probably is law already, is it?
Not that I'm aware of, but I think that should happen, and it should be introduced. The Chagast even did a study on there was an accidental invasive species included in a native seed packet that was actually blackgrass, and it ended up being planted and then introducing a native species. So there definitely needs to be some regulation there to ensure that this isn't being spread. His second question, are there any studies on the effect that non-native species have had? Yes, there are. When I was researching this myself, I came across some really good articles, and there's one from the Dublin Naturalist Field Club that basically discuss in detail what I've been bringing up today, about the effects that this can have and what is actually a great thing to do to help in terms of native versus non-native. Yeah.
Amy, I'm going to stop you there because I'm very conscious of time. Thank you very, very much for your time. A pleasure talking to you. And we are on the one side. I'm just throwing in the questions as they're coming to me. So you might stay kind of behind the scenes there for a minute, if you don't mind, just because I've no doubt we'll get some more questions in on this. But for now, I better get back to all the questions which have been coming in. Thanks, Amy.
Great, thank you.
Now, Grania is asking me here, moving on from wildflowers. Hi Peter, my variegated Wigelia has finished flowering. Is it okay to cut it back now? Well, yes, Grania, that's a very, I love the simple ones at the right time of the year. That's a yes. So you can cut that back now. And you can, with Wigelia, you can actually cut it back as hard as you want. I have a huge one outside in my own garden. Any regular viewers will know I only moved garden. My wife would say we moved house, but I say we moved garden about this time last year. So I'm only kind of getting to grips with what's there and what isn't there. Hack back the Wigelia, and I hacked mine back. It was absolutely huge and unkempt. Probably this time last year, and it was full of flowers again this year. So yes, you can. There's another one that came in there that I missed it. Oh yeah, it's from Marie Byrne. Marie sent this question in with a picture, trying to identify this tall plant. I'll just bring up the picture here for Marie. That, Marie, to me looks like a hollyhock, I would say would be my best bet. A tall plant. So if it's 6 or 7 foot in height, they look like flower buds in the leaf axils there. So I would say very definitely, I'd be confident that that is hollyhock. See what other questions are coming in. As I said, if you do enjoy the episode or any of the episodes, please do feel free to share the video or tag anybody in the comments who might be interested, particularly in the conversation I just had with Amy about the importance of native species and non-native species. And we're coming close to past, so I'm going to wind it up. Thanks very much to everybody for watching. Thanks for getting the questions in. If I didn't get to yours, and I know there's a few I didn't get to, I'll do my very best to get to them at the start of next week's piece. That'll be next Friday, and every Friday 1 p.m. here on Ask the Gardener, on the Irish Gardener. We're on Facebook and also now on LinkedIn and YouTube. It was a pleasure to have Amy with us. I didn't realise the time. But for now, until next Friday, thanks for tuning in.